everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Bree Buonomo. Hi if you're new here, or hey if you've been here before. And today, one of my most popular videos that typically happens is talking about my most disappointing reads of the year. In this instance, we're going to talk about my most disappointing reads of 2021. So because I only read 31 books in the year 2021, I decided to only do 5 books of my least favorite and 1 honorable mention. Now, just to note before I dive into the list is that I am a writer and I would like to be a published author one day as well. So these books aren't me attacking the author. It's not me like questioning, their existence or anything like that. It's just that the books really didn't jive with me for various reasons. So for that, I'm just going to talk about why they disappointed me to various levels, and that be that. So without further ado, let's just jump into my list. The first book I'm going to talk about that I read in 2021 is my honorable mention, and it's an honorable mention for 2 reasons. One is because I am going to continue the series, so I don't feel like it's that disappointing overall. And 2, it was also a reread. And for that reason, Blood Rose Rebellion by Rosalind Eves is on my disappointing list as the honorable mention. This book was a reread for me, and when I got an arc of it in 2016, I believe it was, I was obsessed. Like, I devoured the arc. I think I read it in one day, and I don't know what it was, but I was like just so obsessed with the concept and the characters and everything to do with it. So this book follows a main character named Anna, who is part of like the high society in France and has a lot of influence with her family. And in this world, which is a historical fiction, it is set in like the past in France and Hungary. The royals are what are called luminates, which are the holders of magic. So when people have magic, you are also considered a royal, and thus you have all the power in the world, both politically and magically. So Anna is born into her family and is at her sister's debut when her sister is, coming of age and displaying her power to try to have a magical alliance. Anna kind of ruins that, and there's a whole plot that unfolds where Anna really doesn't seem to have much magic, but there's something about her that tends to wreck spells. And because of the blunder, she messes up her sister's debut and kind of has a scandal of kissing a boy, and that's really looked down upon. So she gets sent with her grandmother to Hungary, where there's a war and revolution happening, and a lot of the Romani are being persecuted. And Anna kind of gets tied up in all of that political atmosphere, which is also tied to the magic. It is an interesting book, I will say that. It did come out in early 2017. As I mentioned, I had an arc in 2016. So it is a little bit dated as far as the writing style of it, but I also think that this is more of a true young adult. Like, if you have a young adult in your life and you are sick of all of the like sex and complications that we are seeing in YA being kind of gravitated towards adults and not actually young adults, recommend this book for them because I think they would love it. And that could possibly why I was disappointed on my reread, because I am 5 years older now and actually I'm moving on 6 years, and I don't know if I was just at a younger age and I enjoyed it more, but this book fell a little bit flat to me. The world itself, which is why I'm not really counting it as a disappointment, it's a very slow and a little bit duller than I remembered it being. There really isn't a ton of romance. Like, there is romance, but I remember specifically absolutely adoring this one character, and he's really not in it that much. So I don't know if when I finally read the finished copy that it changed a lot, because I remember being obsessed with his character when I read the arc, and I was like, oh my god, like he's my boo, like I love him. And then I reread it and I'm like, he's like in 5 pages of this whole novel. Like, where did he go? The other character I really do love, and I feel like, again, there was a little bit of insta love in it. So, and that's like the true love interest. The other one really wasn't. It was just another character. And this one was a love interest, but unfortunately on the reread was kind of insta lovey, which is something I really just hate anymore and I have a whole tropes I hate list, so insta-love is one of them. Without, you know, going too much further in depth with this novel, it was just not my favorite reread. I gave this a 4-star the first time I read it, which surprises me. I honestly thought I would have been more generous and given it a 5-star back in the day, but I didn't. I gave it a 4, and upon my reread, I knocked it down to 3 stars. I do think this is a good novel, and I am going to continue the series, but if you have teenagers in your life that are looking for a cute historical fantasy novel without all the like sex and more mature themes, give them this book. And now on to my true list of most disappointing. We're starting off with The 12 by Justin Cronin. This is the only book on this list that is still on my possession, but I am trying to sell this. I am not going to be keeping this book. I really hated it a lot. So I think my hatred with this book really started because I read The Passage by Justin Cronin, which is the first book in the series, with my friend Autumn Ashley for our read-along group, which was just the two of us kind of discussing books on the internet together and doing sort of a book club. And when we read The Passage, I had been putting it off for so many years, and I definitely thought that I wouldn't end up loving it. I had heard mixed things about this series as a whole, and I really wasn't sure if I was going to jive with it. And then, lo and behold, I really, really loved The Passage. It was, I wouldn't say my favorite book because it doesn't really resonate with me the way some of my other favorite books do, but I enjoyed it a lot. So I was equally excited to pick up The 12 and equally disappointed in the end. I ended up actually DNFing this book about 60% of the way. I did give it a really good try. I really pushed through it. I struggled a lot, and I just couldn't put myself, like every time I kept trying to listen to it and read it, I kept putting myself in a negative headspace, and that is my sign that a book is not working for me and we're just going to DNF it. So I did. Autumn powered through, but also didn't like it. I think she liked it a little bit more than me, but we were both kind of just struggling with it. The plot itself was a little bit confusing and convoluted. In the first book, things were like drawn out and very descriptive, and it worked really well because you were going from like 100 years. Like, so you're following 2 different timelines and weaving them together. And I do typically love storylines like that. Some of my favorite books and movies is that trope and that type of style of telling. So I loved it. This tried to do the same thing where it was following 2 different sections of people, but it got really confusing for me. And at one point, not only did I not know whose chapters we were on and what story we were telling, but I wasn't even sure like what years this took place. And I'm still not. I don't know if it was like the past and the present and the future, the past and the future. I don't know. I don't know what the timeline was for this book. And to be honest, I could barely tell you what happens in this book. This is how far I put it out of my mind. I was expecting to get somewhere else, and eventually you do get to that place in this book, but I did not read it enough to find out. And overall, I guess that this is like a lesson, and when you do something so well the first time, you maybe shouldn't try the same formula the second time. And I think that's kind of what I learned with this book, is that just because something else can go so well doesn't mean that it's going to follow through. And to be honest, I am okay getting rid of this book, and I don't think I'm going to continue in the series ever at this point. I don't have any interest in finishing the trilogy, but I will keep The Passage, and I will likely return to The Passage because I think it's a good book, and I think it can stand alone. Granted, it doesn't really work that well. Like, there's still a lot of questions I have that were not answered in my reading of this and the 60% of the way I got through, but I would be okay just looking up spoilers at this point. I'm not really too bent out of shape for not knowing those answers. So I think I can just look at The Passage as a standalone novel and enjoy that. Next, we're getting into the books that I don't even have in my possession anymore because I already unhauled them and sold them to someone else that I hope enjoys them much more than I did. The first on this list is Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. Lesbian necromancers in space. That was how this was pitched to me, and I was so excited for it. And I think there was some of that aspect in there, but I expected the romance to be a little bit more present, and it wasn't. I definitely felt misled quite a few times because, to begin with, there were a couple characters introduced in the beginning, and I thought the author was going to try to shoo these like 2 characters in particular together. And I was going to be really mad about it because it was going to be like so unbelievable if that was the case. And that actually didn't happen, which I was fine with. But then I felt like because there was almost like a misleader, like I was waiting for them to get together this entire time and be disappointed that when they finally, the main character was paired with another person-ish, it came out of nowhere. I feel like it really wasn't put together very nicely. It was kind of insta-lovey, and it just fell flat overall. I wasn't very enthused about the romance. But I think that was my favorite part of the book. Even though it wasn't extremely well done in my opinion, or well done for my tastes, it was probably the better part. The biggest issue I had with this book is I was very, very confused the entire time. I think listening to it or reading it would have had the same level of confusion for me, because I think my struggle was with the descriptors in the book. I don't think the descriptions were very good, and I think that's why it lent to me being confused a lot of times. Or it just wasn't done in a way that is conducive for me and how I visualize things. And it could just be on me, because I do know that people really do love this book. It has like over a 4 on Goodreads, which is kind of insane, all things considered. And I did not feel the same way. And that's really unfortunate, because this was one of my most anticipated reads of the year. This was a buddy read that I was doing with 2 of my friends. I think I'm the only one that actually read it, to be honest, out of the 3 of us. But it was just fine, and maybe a little less than fine for me. So yeah, overall, I was just very sad. I wish there was better descriptions, and I wish the romance was a little bit more clear cut. And it could have just been me, like I said, but the way that the novel was written, and because the love interest didn't come in until so much later, that I really thought that 2 other characters were going to be the couple the entire time, and I wasn't happy about it. So that could have also led to my enjoyment. But at the end of the day, I don't know what happened in this book. I really can't tell you. I know that there is some necromancy. I know that there is like a space structure. I know that there's like rings and levels. Like these people, the necromancers, like are in the 9th circle and they're like all the way at the bottom. But I don't know if it's a spaceship or a planet. I know that they eventually go out of this spaceship and they are going into the world or a different planet or something. I can't really explain it to you. I don't know it. So that was just my disappointment. And I think if I was able to better describe what happened, I just might have enjoyed it more. But because I'm sitting here still wondering what was going on, it's on this list. And next on the list, we are going to talk about Legendborn by Tracy Deonn. This is another book that has an extremely high rating on Goodreads. And I am like so happy for it, honestly. I am so happy that the author has a ton of accolades. It's almost a 4.5 on Goodreads. And I do feel like that's almost unheard of. So it's kind of wild to me that I didn't like it. So first of all, I do like the book as well because the main character's name is Bree, B-R-E-E. And I was very excited for that because I love my name and I was very happy to see a book character have it as well. And Bree is a 17-year-old who gets an early acceptance to UNC Chapel Hill, which I believe is in North Carolina. And this is an urban fantasy, and I would probably argue it's definitely upper YA, if not NA. Like, it probably should be a new adult category if new adult was officially a thing. The secret society that she stumbles into is called the Legendborn, and they are a bunch of ancestors of the Arthurian Round Table. And there is a boy that is called the Merlin, and she kind of like follows him, and they end up getting roped into this dark aura that is kind of happening around the college. And of course, Bree figures out that she also has some kind of ability, and it's kind of unheard of. There's also a lot of commentary on racism and institutional racism, which is totally wonderful. That part of the book is like, I think I can't speak about that, and I think it is done well from just an observer point of view and not someone who's experienced it. So that definitely has its praises, and I don't want to take that away. The biggest thing for me is I just don't think I like the content of the book. And it was well written, it's a really good journey, and it has a lot of good points of view, both for the fantasy elements and for the takes on racism. But my biggest gripe is that this book reminded me so much of Shadowhunters. A lot of it reminded me of Shadowhunters. And there was parts where I was like narrating the book as I was reading it to 2 of my friends. This was another buddy read of ours. A lot of my buddy reads are on this list. I just realized, including my honorable mention, 5 of the 6 were buddy reads for me. So maybe then 2022, I gotta figure out better buddy reads. Anyway, I digress. So I was narrating the things and I was pointing out like all of these similarities. And I don't know if the author intended to do that. I'm sure she didn't. And maybe Shadowhunters was a book that she really loved and wanted to see more of the themes that she had in her book in this. And that could be possible. I mean, people love to pick up books that are similar to books we loved. So if you love Shadowhunters, I guarantee you're going to adore Legendborn. For me, I did not. I don't really care for the Shadowhunters world. The Mortal Instruments in particular I'm talking about, I did not really care for that series, and so much so that I ended up unhauling all of Cassandra Clare's books without reading most of them. I decided that if I was going to read it, I would pick up an audiobook, but I have no interest in continuing in her world after I finish the Mortal Instruments. And that's on me. It's just not my cup of tea. But because of that, Legendborn really did. I feel like I could have like matched up characters with like who they were similar to in the Mortal Instruments. Plot points I also felt were very similar. Things that happened in both series were very, very similar. And that is just how I perceived it. And because of that, I really didn't like it because I really did not like the Mortal Instruments. I really didn't care for the plots and I felt those stories dragged on. And this book, Legendborn, is a chunker. It is, I think, 501 pages. So it was a longer book to read, and I felt like I was just trying to get through it So ultimately, that ended up on this list. I wanted to love it, and just wasn't the right book for me. But if you like the Mortal Instruments, I do think you will like this, and you should definitely give it a read. Next, we have an adult contemporary book that I might actually say that I hated. And honestly, I gave it a 3 stars, and I feel like that's generous for how much the ending of this book made me feel. And that book is The Light We Lost by Jill Santopolo. This was the only book I've ever read by the author. I don't know, it didn't really stand out to me enough that I would want to pick up another book by her. But I'm not saying never, it just wasn't my cup of tea. So this book follows a woman named Lucy who, throughout the story, again, this is one of those books that you can, like, it's kind of being told in 2 different points of views. You're following Lucy now and Lucy back when she was in college and with this guy named Gabe. One of my favorite tropes, when done well. And this book follows Lucy as she is kind of like struggling with the life that she chose for herself. And it's almost like a what if story on what if I chose differently, or can I choose something to make my life different? And it follows Lucy and Gabe on how, again, going back and forth from how they met in college and became like instant lovers, but never ended up like following through on things because they both wanted other stuff in their lives. Like they both wanted to have their careers and a relationship and everything else, and they couldn't make it work, so they parted ways. And then Lucy goes on and has a bunch of experiences without Gabe. She gets married, she has children, like she does the life that she thought she wanted. I am gonna just say, like, I feel like my audience won't watch this book, but I'm gonna say spoiler alert now because I can't talk about this book without spoiling the ending for it, because the ending is what killed the book for me and made me so irrationally mad. So with that out of the way, you can skip to, I'll maybe put a timestamp on when you can skip to if you don't want to hear spoilers. But for those of you staying with me, this book at the end goes through the what if scenario on like, let me reflect back on my life. And in my point of view, I feel like it would have been a good like growth moment and for something to learn. But instead, the book and the author decided to put in an entire cheating plot line. And that, I don't like to read that. It's not something that unless like if you're not following the main character, like it's almost like that's the issue I think I had, is the main character is the one that actively decides to cheat on her husband to see what if it would be like if she ended up staying with Gabe. And I hated that so much because I'm in the main character's point of view. It's different, I think, if you're watching like another character in a book from the main character's point of view cheating on and kind of going with those things. And it's also different like if you're gonna learn from that mistake. But Lucy does not in this novel. She like finds out that Gabe is gonna die and he has like some kind of disease, cancer or something, and like his one wish is to know like how it would have been like with them. And she goes and she cheats on her husband and then never says anything to her husband. And it just enraged me. I absolutely hated it. So if you're like me and you don't like a cheating plotline, just never pick this book up. And now that I've kind of said my spoiler a bit, to sum all of this up, if you wanted a moral of the story, then you don't get one in this book. It all leads up to this one event that happens, and then the event happens and the main character learns nothing from it, doesn't think she has anything wrong with her actions, and the book ends. So for that reason, I hated this book. It's not a plot line for me. It's not a story for me. And I'm so sad that I received it. And I will say, I won this in a giveaway like years ago, and it was touted as a romance novel. So the fact that the romance is like horrible and gives you so many like terrible ideals, I don't recommend it. So if you like romance, don't read this. And lastly, the most disappointing on this list is the most disappointing because I think this was my most anticipated book of 2021, and I am so devastated that I did not like it. And that is Lore by Alexander Bracken. So up until this point, I'd never read an Alexander Bracken novel. I've heard from many people that she is a hit or miss author. You either really love her writing and really drive with what she writes, or you're not going to get along with it and you don't really care. However, the premise of this book was so interesting, and I got an exclusive signed edition from Owl Crate, and I was like, oh my god, I can't wait for this. And I ended up selling it because I will never read it again. So basically this concept is that like back in ancient Greece, when like the gods ruled and everyone still worshipped them, there were families that were descendants of these gods. So all of the gods were actual people that kind of ascended into this power, and they would become like immortal. So then all the families, like once that person would die, like it would be passed on to everyone. So thus there would always be a god, and it was the main gods in the Greek pantheon. So you have Ares and Athena and Zeus and Poseidon, Artemis, you know, the work. So all of these people are in these families, and it's like every 7 years or something, and it's called the Aegon. So basically it's almost like in a battle, like you have like people like who are gods among you, and when it's time, like everyone tries to kill that god to inherit the power. So it's not even just like it passes on. It's an interesting concept, and in theory it sounds pretty cool. My biggest thing is that the story was very confusing. Most of the time I was wondering what was going on, and I had a really hard time with the descriptors. I didn't understand what was happening. I really didn't understand the dynamics. There was a lot of implausible things that happened in this book for me too, because this book takes place in New York City in the present time, and a lot of the things that would happen, I literally would actively be like, well, why wouldn't people react to this? Well, how is this affecting the rest of the world? Like, they're running amok in the streets. Like, how aren't people seeing these, like, these things? How are people not affected by power outages? So there's just a lot of questions that came up that were never answered. I do have a hard time suspending my disbelief when books are urban fantasy, unless you are making it known that creatures or fantasy or gods are known in our world, and that's kind of a given. So like, oh yeah, any given day a god's just running amok down the street and this is normal in New York City. Unless you tell me that, I have a hard time believing that these things wouldn't affect other people and the plot of the story. There was one part in particular where like something blows up and no one comes to see it. This is New York City. I mean, down the street in my little city, I would be out on the road looking to see what was blowing up. Like, it's, you know what I mean? New York City has so many people in it. So there was a lot of things that didn't really make sense to me. And ultimately, it just was very dry and bland. I really never got a sense of who the characters were, what their personalities were. I never really got a sense of action. And something was happening quite frequently in this book. Like, something was always happening, but it never actually felt like anything was happening. So it dragged on, and I was so sad that I wasn't enjoying myself. And the more I think about it, the more disappointed I am with it and how I feel about it. I'm disappointed in myself. And I think the biggest failure for me in this book too was that, along with the characterization lacking, the main character has a ton of history that we aren't ever told about, especially in the beginning of the book when it matters. So when people start being introduced later in the book, they have no emotional impact on me, and I just quite frankly didn't care about anything, which I think is really what hindered the book. It was just such a cool concept and a great idea, and I love mythology and I love mythological retellings. So I seriously thought I was going to love this book, and that's kind of why it's at the top of my list for most disappointing. It just did not live up to the expectations I set for myself. It had a beautiful cover, a nice premise, and I really didn't enjoy it. So unfortunately, it is my #1 most disappointing of the year. I don't feel like I'm alone in my thoughts on lore. I feel like a lot of the people I talk to, including my buddy Reed, this is the one book that we all actually read together, and we all did not like it. So I know I'm not alone, but surprisingly, the Goodreads does have like a 3.85. So people like it apparently, just not the people I've been talking to or watching on YouTube. But hey, if you like it, I'm so happy for you, and I'm absolutely glad you like it because I wanted to. But there you have it. Those are the books that disappointed me the most in 2021. Most of these books are just because of my taste and me not liking the content that they were similar to or what they provided. And some were just because I had better expectations and higher expectations, and it did not deliver. And ultimately, that's my fault on all ends. Sometimes we just don't jive with the books, and that's okay. I still think that a lot of these authors on this list are very talented. I actually didn't have any problems with the writings this year, which is usually a big flag for me of why they might be a most disappointing book for me, is because the writing is usually bad. But I've done better, at least for finding books that are well written, and all of these books are well written. So if you are going to pick that up and you liked the content it provided, I think you'd be fine. The themes, the plot, the way that it all played out didn't work, and that's my list for 2021. Let me know down below what books you didn't jive with this year, any that you hated or just were super disappointed in like me. And let me know what you thought about any of these books if you read them. Did you love some of them that I didn't like, or did you also agree with me on my thoughts? I'd love to know down below. And until next time, I'll see you then.